So some countries don't have enough food, leading to undernourishment, while other countries have plenty of food and an obesity problem. And wars are fought over food. But just as water is distributed unevenly over the planet, food is distributed unevenly. And so food insecurity is a real problem in countries around the world. 12,000 years ago, humans were hunter-gatherers, spending the majority of each day searching for food. And that was the reason for much of human evolution, was to basically improve the body's ability to search for food. The ability to walk on 2 legs instead of 4 is the endurance running hypothesis. So 10,000 years ago, humans learned to grow crops and domesticate animals. That's farming for food instead of searching for food. So this eventually led to the agricultural revolution that is what we have now, is large-scale farming. So current-day agricultural farming has allowed for growth of the worldwide human population to the 7 billion humans now. We have food insecurity, but it's not as much of a problem as it should be for 7 billion humans. We know that food is distributed unevenly around the world, so it's dependent on the countries that have too much to help those that have not enough, which perhaps was the reason for the Nobel Peace Prize in October 2020 going to the World Food Program. There are other drawbacks, which include land use for producing all this food. There's also transporting food all over the world. That takes a toll. And then there's also the processing of these processed foods. So it's important to ask, is this sustainable? Is our current agricultural revolution of large-scale farming sustainable? Well, remember, there's the 3 aspects of sustainability. There's the environmental, there's economic, and there's the social. Large-scale farming utilizes natural resources. And this graph shows the need for grain, the mass in kilograms of grain to provide these types of food: milk, chicken, egg, pork, and beef. So grain, such as corn, is required to feed chickens and pigs and cows. And so those cows produce milk and those chickens produce egg. So you have to feed these animals, and it requires about 1 kilogram of grain. This is 1.1, to get about 1 kilogram of milk. It takes about 2.8 kilograms of grain or corn fed to the chickens to get 1 kilogram of chicken. So you can start to ask yourself, well, then why not just eat the 1 kilogram of corn instead of feeding it to the chicken? You get about a third back if you're feeding about 3 kilograms of corn to the chicken and then only getting 1 kilogram of chicken meat back. It just continues upward, comparing to getting 1 kilogram of beef, which is about 2 pounds of beef. To get that 1 kilogram of beef, you have to feed the cow 20 kilograms of corn, 20 kilograms of grain. Wow, that is not a very good return. That's just a logic question. Now, growing all that corn, growing all that grain requires farming, and farming requires land. And so farms take up surface space. Currently, over 30% of Earth's land surface is used for production of livestock, mostly to grow all that. Looking at this, the same 1 kilogram of chicken, egg, milk, pork, or beef is represented in square meters of land. So now we're getting into the environmental aspect of sustainability, where chickens don't require much land at all, about 14 square meters, and that's because literally a chicken is given a cage that's about the size of an 8 by 11 piece of paper. So chickens don't require much space, but in comparison, to grow 1 kilogram of beef requires 245 square meters of land. That's not because cows take up space, it's because you need to grow a lot of corn. You need to grow that 20 kilograms worth of corn, which takes up a lot of space, to feed to the cows, which also require land space for grazing. Well, that's the requirement why all these farms take up surface space, is to grow the food to feed to the cows that we then eat. maybe it does make more sense to just eat the corn instead of feeding it to the chickens or the pigs or the cows. As humans have turned to industrialized large-scale farming and also become more affluent, their diets in general have more meat. Over the past 40 years, the per capita, per person consumption of meat has more than doubled. What's on this graph here is the types of meat are variable: beef, sheep, pork, and poultry. But since 1964, here, 97, 99, this has gone from about 20 to almost to 40, but it's predicted to get to above or double, about 45% by 2030. And that's because of usually affluence in countries. Can the planet sustain this projected need or demand for meat? Well, we know there's not enough land space to grow all of the grain will be required for the livestock these animals need to eat. Where the meat is coming from. So a lot of it coming from Brazil, which is requiring basically cutting down Amazon rainforest. So there's land there, but that land was important as far as the planet. Environmentally, the Amazon rainforest provides a lot of the photosynthesis and then oxygen to Earth's atmosphere. We use a lot of land in the United States for livestock and also in Europe and China. This amount of land in Brazil represents an environmental problem. We know that producing food requires land space, and that is called a food print here. A food print is how much land is required per year for one person's food needs. It's mostly dependent on how much meat is eaten per day. So this is the amount of land needed for a New York citizen based on, for 1 year, based on the meat consumption. So how many grams of meat per day. And what's interesting to note is, okay, so if you eat 381 grams of meat per day, that's going to need about 2 acres of land. That's the largest food print, so food footprint. But this is almost equivalent. So eating 0 grams of meat per day, that's about half an acre. But you can actually still be pretty close, about half an acre, 0.6 acres, and still have some meat. So this is 63 grams of meat per day, which is not that many grams per day. It's about 2 ounces per day. And so since usually people have more ounces of meat per serving, and so that means that being 100% vegetarian is not necessarily needed. It's not efficient because these 100% vegetarian still requires fruit and nuts, and that still requires land. So eating a small amount of meat per day, about 2 ounces per day, which really breaks out into 2 or 3 times of meat meals per week, that's the most efficient for feeding the most people if we're just talking about the land, the food footprint. So this is called flexitarian, which is semi-vegetarianism. It's mostly plant-based with some meat.